Welcome to another episode of our series that we are doing in collaboration with Alserkal's series Cultures in Conversation, which is a series of multidisciplinary events, cross-cultural conversations, and artistic interventions, which has been commissioned by Expo2020 and programmed by Alserkal. This series is entitled Preludes and Postscripts, and today's theme is burning issues. With me, we have three fantastic panelists. Ellen Carroll is an award-winning artist and activist whose prolific career as a conceptual artist spans more than 20 years and occupies the disciplines of architecture, design, film, writing, performance, and technology. Adib Dada is an architect and an eco-activist, founder of the Dada Integrated Architecture Lab, whose mission is to activate projects across architecture, design, and art by creating unconventional links at the frontier of science. And Tansha Vora is a researcher and a current resident at the Serendipity Arts Foundation. Her work explores the intersectionality of food, community, and culture, and the role these elements play in designing future food systems. Welcome everyone to this conversation. I'd love to go around the room and talk a little bit about the nature of the theme of today's conversation, burning issues. I would imagine that each of you are working on issues that you think are burning to some degree. So Mary Ellen, maybe I can start with you and then we'll go around the room. I'd love to understand from you if you feel the urgency of the issues that you are sort of interrogating in your work has increased over time, over the span of your career. Do you feel like things are more urgent now than they have ever been?
So, Mikey, thank you. And also to, the fellow panelists on this. That's a good question. I mean, I think that one of the things is that by now, I've worked on things durationally. And so I think of it really compositionally that there can be an ending, but there is no ending. And so things get amplified, of which they're very loud and it's necessary for something to be done, or they recede in a manner that can be very quiet and shorter. The pressing issues today, of which there are many, and that everybody is experiencing respectively throughout the world, seem completely off the charts. I mean, in terms of, the nature of, the climate emergency, right? The wars that are taking place, migration, all of these things that are interrelated, and the rise of nationalism and other things that we're seeing at a moment when there's also an increase of the necessity of a global understanding. So in a way, you can't be at this sort of heightened engagement with all of it. And so I think just, when there's moments where things recede and then they move to the sort of foreground. And I would say two things specifically that I, have worked on pretty much my entire adult life would be climate and also migration and asylum.
Before we move on, I'd love to just sort of talk a little bit about where we are in 2022 and if you feel like the degree to which these issues resonate with the public has increased over time. Have you noticed that more people are paying attention and are responding to your work and the work of your colleagues in a way that has inspired you or encouraged you or maybe has sort of discouraged you?
In 2006, I was commissioned by an organization called the Precipice Alliance that was founded by the photographer Joel Sternfeld and the editor Donna Wingate. They wanted to do large-scale public works on pressing issues. The first topic that they were focusing on was climate change or global warming at that point. I was awarded that commission. All of my work begins in language and writing. So with that, it seemed that it had to be apparent that it had to be a work that would provoke some kind of thinking and discussion and action as a call to action. The work is called Indestructible Language. It was put up in New Jersey intentionally at a temporary site, highly, highly visible, where that propositionally that would occur. It did occur, but then 2008 happened. The economic downturn globally that affected everywhere, including, we had a discussion about Dubai and the planning of the city and what changed and where it is now when I was just there. But I'm raising that because COP26 just happened, and this work of mine, Indestructible Language, was put back up. The difference being is that it wasn't enough just to put up something in the public, right? There had to be not only a call to action, but action. And we were aware of that. And so doing work on climate migration and some programs that we're doing throughout the world, but namely at the US-Mexico border, and something called RSVP was linked to that, right? So you have something in the public that amplifies what's being done on the ground simultaneously. And that's why I'm so looking forward to hearing from Adib and Tonsha in terms of what the work is that they're doing and where we intersect.
Thanks for that. Adib, maybe I can have you chime in as well. As a resident of Beirut, it feels to me like the urgency of the work that you're doing and the sort of the burning nature of the work you're doing is only increasing by the minute and the hour and the day. But I'm curious from your perspective as somebody who's been working on this for much longer, what does it feel like for you?
For me, the crisis I'm looking, or the burning question is, it's global. It's not just related to Lebanon. Like, how can we address, there's a twin crisis in the world. It's not just about climate change, but there's also the crisis of biodiversity loss. And they're called twin crises because they are dependent on each other. And so as humans, we're looking just at the climate change aspect or the global warming aspect, because we're looking at it just from a human-centric lens and with a very short-sighted outcome. Whereas we should be treating them both, equally, like with equal importance and urgency. And for me, this is, really comes down to this kind of disconnect from nature that we're all familiar with, and we see it all around us. And it's not just that we don't have access to nature, but it's that, as humans, we don't feel that we are nature. We feel that we are other than nature. And so bridging that disconnect is going to be really important in order for us to be able to address both of these challenges. And what makes it particularly, in my context in Lebanon, I think Lebanon is a case study in what the world is headed to if they don't change course. We're seeing all of the crises colliding and amplifying and crashing, in such a short period of time. And I think this is where the world is headed if we don't change course. So
there should be a sign outside the airport, welcome to the future. So let's bring Tonsha into the conversation. Tonsha, you are looking at very small, tiny problems in some ways that are enormous. So I'd love to understand if you could shed some light on the burning issue that really occupies most of what you're working on.
So I think for me, the thing that started happening was when I started identifying what these different burning questions are and what these different problems are. What started emerging is that really all the problems are connected. In some sense, I think because to accept only that is just too daunting for my mind. I think somewhere I enforced a sense of hope into my belief to say if the problems are connected, then perhaps the solutions are as well. And I think that that's really something that was a thought that sort of cemented how I was going to look at these series of problems and figure out which one I was going to tackle. And to me, it became more apparent that in a state of absolute confusion and just lack of any motivation to be able to do anything, I was looking at my plate of food and I was like, I don't even know where this comes from. I don't even know where my food's coming from, who's growing it, how it's got to my plate. That sort of spiraled into an exploration of food security and how our food reaches us and who it could also be reaching but doesn't for different reasons. And that sort of led me into looking at food structures and food systems and how broken those are. I think the pandemic really highlighted food insecurity, to me, at least in India. And, when you had farmers protesting, you had migrants walking for hundreds and hundreds of kilometers without any food or water. I think that really shocked me, that we hadn't been able to figure out how to provide food for our people in the midst of a crisis and an emergency. And that just led me to think that, wait, do we have food potentially around us that we're not accessing? Is there sources of food that we've just forgotten? And that led me to studying insects and insect protein and the history and culture of insect eating in India, and how we could use this information to generate solutions to the food crisis in the future.
I'm largely uninformed on this topic, Tansha. So I'd love to understand what places that you are sort of looking at around the world and drawing inspiration. Who's doing this well?
Okay, actually, there's a number of countries that are super on it. Off the top of my head, I know America, Canada, Australia, Mexico, and a couple of countries that they're not as formally developed, but as these countries are, but Thailand and Cambodia eat a lot of insects. There's news now of massive companies like Nestle and Mars generating insect-based animal food and using insects as feed, as opposed to soy, which is, as we all know, the number one destructor of all things good and natural in this world. Just a statistic, last year was the first time India imported soy. We've never imported soy before, and we did directly from South America, which means we are absolutely culpable for the destruction of the rainforest. And when I was reading these things, and I was just like, wait, this doesn't make any sense. Like this kind of damage, this kind of catastrophe just doesn't make any sense. We're looking at, our oceans are overfished. Our population is growing. We cannot cut one more tree down in a forest. It's just for farmland. It's not an option. And when you look at, I think it was in 2013, the UN, the FAO released a huge document called Edible Insects, and basically just a study of how many people in the world are eating insects, which insects they're eating, and what we're doing with it. At the time of the report, over 2 billion people in this world eat insects not out of desperation, out of choice. It is absolutely intrinsic to human evolution. There's immense work done about women's reproductive ecology and women's evolution intersecting with insects and foraging, which is just fascinating to me. So there's over 2 billion people already eating them, and we in India, there's a great sense of taboo because of the caste system. There is a huge, there's this idea that insects are dirty food and dirty people eat dirty food. And because of these notions, we've sort of erased a lot of information that we otherwise could have access to. And I think that I don't think we're seeing that in any other country. At least not from my knowledge. I think a lot more countries are ready to accept insect protein as alternatives. But in our country, my country, we're not there yet. 14% of India is considered to be undernourished. And 14% seems like, okay, that seems like a big number. But when you look at the actual number of people, that's 190 million people undernourished in this country. And we have food. We have food absolutely around us. It's not that when we don't have enough to feed all the people here. It's just the systems are completely broken. And I know that's not what you asked me.
No, that's great. This is precisely the type of education I'm looking for. Okay, Mary Ellen, I want to come back to you and ask you a question a little bit about some of the first words I read in your bio, which are artist and activist.
Yeah.
I'm curious if those two hats ever feel like they're in conflict with each other for you. Do you feel like there is a limitation to the role art can play in instigating change? Or do you feel like these two roles amplify each other and are actually work perfectly in tandem?
They're not mutually exclusive, and normally, those kinds of descriptors that are applied to us are somebody else is saying them, right? And then they get sort of bioed into what you end up sharing with other people. So it's an external determination, but it then characterizes, what I'm doing, right? And how the work occupies these other disciplines that are both within public policy, which I like the intersection of why we're coming together in this conversation between all of us, because I would say that, everybody here is engaged on that level. Also with technology, and then also, the built environment. At certain point it does recede. I mean, some of the engagement is just purely that, right? It doesn't have anything to do with art, and then vice versa. I did want to interject one thing that I think is really interesting that I ended up seeing in Houston, Texas, about food and, these food deserts, and also in terms of biodiversity and humans. There's a program at a county hospital that was developed by, it took the initiative of somebody at a sort of high decision-making level to meet an organic farmer in an area where there was a food desert in the middle of the city, but also where that hospital is a public hospital, and they were seeing diabetes rates that were off the charts. The hospital hired an organic farmer to actually farm on the land. They're farming like 5 acres of property. They've created this pharmacy. It's cute, I know, but the doctors literally write prescriptions and have cooking classes and things. So it made me think of the insects of taboo of like, if you don't have a familiarity, right? If you live in a food desert and there aren't these materials, how do you learn how to eat them, or how do you learn how to use them? And then what is biodiversity, and how, like, where is this holistic approach that's taking place, where we're thinking about what can be done? One other point I'm going to make. In being down at the border and seeing people coming from all over the world, right? So yes, it was the Triangle in Central America, but it's many places. I've seen refugees coming from Africa, South America, the Middle East coming in. One of the things, what people were served when they were either waiting or coming in and being picked up by ICE is horrific. I mean, I won't even go into all the other details that ended up happening, but this idea of like where, cultures and foods and what appears. I mean, this points to, I think, both of the work, that you're both doing. So I think, which hat do you wear, and when? And I think that language, those are things that get determined. I mean, you can say, I am Mary Ellen Carroll, right? But the rest of it is usually it's an externalization of what you're doing and how.
I think that's really interesting, but there's this, the thing with like insect protein, it's a terrific idea. I think the expectations or the reluctance of people, I consider myself quite, adventurous, and I'll try a lot of things, but I'm not yet ready to try, like those exotic insects that you see people eating. I have tried them in different forms, as like flour, as like, when they're like ground into flour and then used to make like bars or biscuits and things like that. So I've gotten to that step where, like I'm willing to take that step. That's Lebanon, no electricity. Thank God for UPS for the Wi-Fi. And so basically, so taking that step to actually like having it transformed in a certain way so that it makes it more accessible, instead of like just imagining that you're eating the actual insect with the legs and all of these things. So I think there's at least this kind of transitional moment or transformation that needs to happen, at least for our generation. And then, I think it's going to become mainstream. And the other thing is, this idea of foraging, I think kind of comes back to Mary Ellen, what you were saying, and about like this kind of like having these organic farmers and having this pharmacy. But kind of like the, foraging can be done in urban areas as well. But we need the tools. We need to learn how to. And then with, let's say, the work that I do, which is planting urban forests, like these can be designed in a way to integrate food systems, but also taken a step further also looking at the insects and how we can forage insects from those places to kind of tie everything together. But there's so much that needs to be like done and taught, and like not expectation, but it's kind of like changing the perception, let's say, of people.
The first ant nest that I ever cut was essentially in an urban food forest, and it was just like, wait, what? And I only cut it because it was eating the cacao, and we were like, no, we want the cacao, so we're gonna get rid of the ants. And they're like, oh wait, you can eat the ants, and we ate them, and they were yum, because they don't look. I mean, when you think of edible insects, you think of something that's like slimy and like all these disgusting textures, but they're not. They're the opposite. They're really sour and beautiful. Through that experience, and through then from that point on, harvesting ant nests specifically, every single time I've done it, I have got the life bitten out of me, right? They bite. It hurts. It's not fun. I get the life bitten out of me, yet I persevere until the last time when I was doing it. I climbed up a tree and I was cutting down the nest, and this guy comes up to me and he's like, but you're doing it all wrong. And I was like, what do you mean? There's like a right way to do this? Like, what's the right way? And he's like, you're doing this in the middle of the afternoon, when you should be doing this at sunrise, when it's too cold for the ants to like be moving as fast, and so they won't bite you as much. And in that moment, I was like, man, how would I have ever figured this out? How would I have ever known that this is the right way, or that there is a right way, or that ants behave differently at different times of the day? And it just, in that moment, seemed like there was so much wisdom already available that we've erased for whatever reason, or just not thought to be important to note down or to like remember. And we're reinventing the wheel when the answers are all in front of us already.
Yeah, I wanted to ask another question related to this. And this is actually related to the comment you made, Tansha, about soy. I remember when I was in high school and university, soy milk was was heralded as this huge development forward, right? If you cared about animals, you shouldn't drink regular milk, you should drink soy milk. And if you're an environmentalist, you should eat soy burgers and stuff like that, right? But when it's done at scale and is filtered through sort of global capitalism, all of a sudden you see these knockoff effects. How do each of you in your own practice start to think about that truth, that every single possible solution, when implemented at scale, could reveal itself to not be the panacea that we're hoping it is, but rather a new burning issue that a future generation is going to have to realize, like, oh my God, we ate every single ant in India, and now there's no trees, and there's no this and there's no that. How do you think through that as folks who have good intentions, who are trying to approach these problems by looking at the past and looking at the future, but we're all fallible. We may actually make huge mistakes as we approach these burning issues.
I mean, I think definitely like this is something that's always in the back of my mind, like, are we doing the right thing? But looking at nature and considering nature as a mentor already gives you a lot of the answer. Like, nature has survived for 3.8 billion years. And so, they're the ultimate like sustainable regenerative model. So the more closely we are emulating, so I'm not talking about copying nature, the more closely we are emulating nature, just really understanding, what are the forms, what are the functions, what are the processes of nature, and emulating those, adapting them to our needs, the more, likely we are to be erring on the side of caution. So that's, for me, it's like always kind of like, would nature evolve to do this? Like, is that something that's pretty much kind of something that nature would do? Yes or no? And so that's for me always kind of like the reference. And then, of course, like keeping up to date with all kind of like research and studies that are coming up so that we can always correct course. I mean, like I'm doing these, we're planting these native forests. But I mean, you could plant forests that are not native and then you're decimating like the whole ecosystem, or you could plant a native forest, but in a place that is supposed to be a prairie, or a place that is supposed to be a mangrove, or a place that's supposed to be, like a desert, and you're bringing a forest and then you're again disrupting this ecosystem. So everything needs to be taken in context, and it's really like, again, everything's interconnected. So we just have to be consciously aware of what we're doing and not just scaling up again, there's no like one solution fits all. Everything needs to be tailored to the location.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Just this idea of, you go in with the best intentions, but I think it was also through the residency we came up with this term called the unintended consequences of your actions. And I think for me, it's been really just two things, primarily. One, at least with the insects, when I started, as the first thing I thought to do with the project is collect recipes. And through collecting recipes, you go in thinking, oh, I'm just going to learn how to clean a silkworm and cook it. But what you end up discovering is seasonality. What months of the year is this insect available in? How do communities who have been eating this insect, how do they harvest them? How do they eat them? Is it the center on the plate? Is it a little bit on the side of the plate? How is this ingredient being used? And I think the idea of like creating insect burgers may not be the best idea. Like, I don't know if it needs to go to like that scale, but to find and understand the places that you want to use this product in, if it at least matches those needs or those preferences, rather than creating a product that you're forcing out onto people to consume for the heck of it. The other thing that I think I've seen at least happen with me is when I talk about the project or the few experiments that I've been working on, everyone's just, okay, so, do you have a product? Are you creating a product? Are people going to be able to buy this? And it's just like, wait, no, I haven't gotten that far, because it takes time. All of these solutions, I know and it's ironic because we're talking about burning questions and we're talking about this absolute urgency that exists with each and every one of these problems. But these solutions take time, and permaculture, and at least the way that I've been introduced to the idea of design thinking, says there's no problem with taking time. Take a year to observe patterns. Take 2 years to observe patterns. See what emerges. There's no hurry, because the chances are that if you hurry, you're going to make blunders that will lead to that many more mistakes. So I think it's just been a lot more about like not getting ahead of myself and not getting ahead of, oh my God, all the wondrous things I can do to the world, but more just like slowly, see what one step does and what the ripple effects are of that step, and constantly asking questions, constantly checking in, constantly, creating a loop of people who will not be afraid to tell you that, hey, listen, I think you need to rethink that. Or, that I think that community and that network is really, really important.
Yeah.
And I don't think we can do it without that, really.
Mary Ellen, I see you nodding along.
Yes, I was nodding out of absolute, agreement. I mean, I think just rather than just reiterate what they were saying, I think that, I think we all have to be vigilant of seeing things as they are, and to also have a kind of agility, and not to react, but to actually act, right? To take the initiative and to understand that sometimes things don't need to be scaled up. Sometimes they just need to be scaled in relation to the local. And that can be enough. Everything doesn't have to be on this, like, it could be manufactured and capitalized upon. And yes, there are some solutions. I mean, I think some solutions related to water, for instance, where there's a kind of universalism that will have an impact. But I think that, it does go back to ourselves, and what are we actually doing and how are we doing it?
I'm curious if maybe there's a good place to end. I'm curious to understand what other problems that you're currently not engaged in a direct way, and this is a question for everybody, other problems, other issues that your work doesn't directly address, but you feel the water boiling. You notice this is something that I'm not directly addressing, but the more I think about it, the more I engage with it, I feel like I'm about to intersect with it. What are some other issues that are either huge issues, or maybe smaller things that you feel like your work will be forced to address in the next 10 years?
So I think what began as a project about edible insects in India slowly became a very personal privilege check, because through this project, I realized that when I went into thinking about, I wonder what the barriers are, why aren't more of us eating insects? My absolute first instinct was it's the British. Blame the British. It's 100% the British's fault. They've definitely had something to do with this whole situation. And that speaks to the fact that I am an upper caste, privileged person living in a city who confronts perhaps the idea of colonization. I confront it a lot easier than I would confront caste. I'm not ever asked what caste I'm from. I'm not ever asked which caste I belong to, because apparently you can see it. And I think that the more I started having conversations about the people who were eating insects, the communities that were eating insects, I was speaking to people belonging to different tribes in the country whose food identity is far from mainstream, from the mainstream Indian construct of what Indian food is. I mean, if there even is such a thing as Indian food. And I think that this was something that I realized was going to be a huge, huge thing. It overwhelms me still, because I get very nervous to talk about it, because I feel like I'm still a privileged outsider who's weighing in on this from this perspective. But what it's done for me, and I can really at this point only speak for myself, is it's made me realize all the systems that I am a part of that would prohibit us from arriving at the solutions for the future. And if I don't start asking the questions, and if I don't start thinking about what systems I'm allowing to perpetuate, and what my world around me is allowing to perpetuate, there's no way we're going to arrive at the solution. So it's not that anybody else has to do any rethinking or refiguring. It's us, it's me. I have to sit and ask myself these really tough questions. The people around me have to start asking themselves these really tough questions. And it's not easy in a country that is riding a huge wave of nationalism, a huge Hindutva nationalism. It's not easy. And so I think this conversation and this acceptance that people who you consider to be lower than you, dirtier than you, lesser than you, actually possess really, really vital, crucial information that might actually save you.
Adib, I think I suspected you wanted to say something as well.
The thing that my work doesn't necessarily address at the moment, I'm looking at the regeneration of terrestrial ecosystems, but there's a whole underwater world that we are not really paying attention to, and that's also a key in kind of addressing the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. So this is something that I foresee is that I'll be looking into in the medium term.
Is that because you are bumping up against it in your work, these gaps of knowledge, and you feel like there's a necessity, or is there just a curiosity? What's going on down there?
Again, everything's related. So these terrestrial ecosystems, the forests are feeding the oceans, and the oceans are feeding the forests, and like all the biomass, the leaves that fall from the forest into the rivers are carried down as nutrients that get flushed out to sea, and then like fish and different animals that then travel back up into the river are taking nutrients back inland. It's so much is happening that we're barely like scratching the surface of. So again, this idea of interconnectedness, and the fact that I'm always interested in looking at the things that not many people are looking at. So I feel there's this, globally, there's this huge, we're not, because again, it's something that we're not confronted to. So people now will recognize what a forest is and what a healthy forest looks like. Mm-hmm. But not many people can recognize what a a healthy ocean ecosystem looks like, or a healthy river ecosystem looks like. So yeah, I think this is definitely somewhere that we need to be headed very fast.
Interesting. Mary Ellen, what about you?
In terms of like one of the things that I've been sort of touching on and thinking about is and I just had a conversation with somebody about this last night at Castle, about decentralization and sovereign lists and border lists, and how that is, from what's beneath the ground, right? So in the oceans, what's under, where, what have these extractive processes been? What's on the ground, right? Where the type of planning and use, both within the land and on the surface. But then what's in the air, right? What's in the airwaves? How is that actually used and occupied? And where is that point of where it can be used in an equitable, right, manner, and where people actually understand what that is? So, and then going, I mean, talk about then shifting from terrestrial then into space, and what does that anticipate of what's being done? So concretely, who knows? I don't have any idea. I mean, I'm mildly, and I would say maybe more than mildly interested in actually the blockchain, because not in crypto, but where you have a system or structure that could be utilized by everybody. And there's certain hurdles because of technology, right? That unless you have, you know, one of these or a computer, are you going to be able to go into it? But I think that all of that will also come into, you know, into accessibility, and also that the environmental considerations of it, which are huge. I mean, they exist. We know that will also be figured out, which it already sort of is. So, but back to, you know, the human, right? And I think that's the thing to go back to focus on.
Well, I think that's a great place to end this conversation. I'd love to thank you for the work that you're doing, and especially sharing your thoughts today, and also engaging with each other. And I hopefully, inshallah, sometime soon we'll be able to have this conversation in the same place.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. And for the listeners who are listening to this podcast, you can go to Alserkal online to watch previous and future episodes of this series. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, Mikey. Thank you both.
Thanks, Mikey.
Thank you so much.